So miss
Hey, Wendy.
you. Hey.
I got something going on up here. I can't quite figure it out. We'll just go with it. I tried to get a haircut in, but I can't get one done before Tuesday for some reason. So it's out of control. So.
I keep having interesting experiences with Turkish barbers at the moment. So I keep thinking I found a regular barbershop in my local town, but no, they light the flame and they start doing the crazy stuff with,
Oh, you don't like?
Well, I don't mind if I get some warning, but when there's something on fire and it's like, what's going on here?
It's a guy thing, but it's for burning basically the hair that grows out of our ears the older and crustier we get.
God.
Really?
But
flame. I don't do this. Yeah.
So I'm totally used to I think it's also levels because I'm used to the flame now. And we've got a Turkish barber. We're a very little village where I live, and we've got a Turkish barber. And I've had the flame thing before, so they kind of indicated that they were going to do that, and I nodded. And the next thing they were putting wax up my nose. And it was in before I'd realized. I was like, yeah, that was a whole.
Wow.
At that point, burning the hair in my ears seems like a step down. Like, yeah, flame, fine.
This is new stuff to me. I don't know about this.
Now, what did I tell you? I said Steve, the storyteller. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry.
no, it's absolutely why. What did you want?
Maybe that's the cold open right there.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, does Steve know about the cold open?
Because they came in with the whole, we do the flame thing, and I was like, yeah, of course. But what they meant is, we do the flame thing, we do the wax up your nose thing, and we're gonna shave your eyebrows. It's like, I wish I'd been a little bit less willing to engage in this whole process.
Oh, that's fascinating. Do they draw them back on or something?
No, they just rub clippers across it.
That's fantastic.
So the flame thing's bad enough with your ears because it smells, but I can only imagine burning the nose hairs must make
no. It's not burning it. It's not burning it. I can't believe we're talking about this. They put like a liquid wax up your nose. It hardens.
And then,
oh
yeah. So I'd rather they took a flamethrower to my nose, quite frankly.
awesome.
Oh, brilliant. Well, this is
Anyway.
all formed up anyway.
Wow. Okay. So, what were we talking about today? Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Consultants Saying Things. I'm Chris Lockhart. Joined today by Oliver Cronk, Wendy Keene, and special guest Steve Forshu Kane, who is the CEO at Scott Logic. And we wanted to talk today. There's been a lot going on with uncertainty in the economy, and there's been some layoffs, and there's been various stories that you hear people talk about of maybe how they were laid off by a bot, or they go to log into their email in the morning and they can't log in. And it really was this question about what is the right way, right, to sort of balance between the needs of a business to restructure and reorganize, but also the respect of the employees, which, by the way, is not just in the interest of the employee, but you want to retain these people and foster a nice environment and have a good culture. And so I think there's this interesting dilemma, right? Or there's some spectrum on which you would want to see many companies fall. And so, Oliver, I know we've talked about this a couple of times. Did you want to give us a little more insight into what you're thinking, and then maybe introduce Steve?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I invited Steve on, and sort of Steve touched on this before we hit the record button, was some of the conversations I had during the sort of recruitment process and interview process going into Scott Logic. So I was pretty apprehensive. As regular listeners to this podcast will know, I had some interesting Big Four consulting experiences, and I'd worked in a niche sort of consultancy before that. And the world of consulting can be a tough gig, as we've talked about time and time again. And I think what had happened for me is I ended up kind of creating two sides of myself. I had a home self and I had a work self, and it all got very stressful when these two realities didn't combine terribly nicely. Family life and work life weren't working very well alongside each other. And so this whole topic speaks to me personally, but also speaks to us as a business at Scott Logic. And so I thought, who better really than to talk about this than Steve, who lives and breathes what we do. People are called out when they're perhaps working excessively or aren't playing nicely along the kind of culture that we endeavour to kind of create at the firm. So I wanted to talk about this because I think whilst nowhere is perfect, Scott Logic of course it isn't perfect. It for me is an amazing balance of the kind of commercial aspects of being a consultancy with really looking after people and community. And so that's really why, and I know Steve talks about this far more eloquently than I do. So I wanted to get Steve involved in this discussion. So yes, Steve, the conversations we had were just really, really interesting. And I know your story as well, your consulting story is really interesting. So I wonder if we should start there, your sort of prior to Scott Logic consulting story.
Sure. I mean, I find myself in the weird position these days, because I normally would introduce, what do you do? I normally introduce myself, I'm a career consultant. I've been working in technology consultancy for the best part of nearly 3 decades. And so I would often introduce I'm a career consultant. I'm not a consultant anymore. I'm now the CEO of a consulting company. So I have to navigate the divide between what I know to be the desirable experience and a productive experience of being a consultant in a consulting business with being the custodian of the organization that brings hundreds of people together to create the special thing that we have in Scott Logic. And so I often have to think about, the unit of one, the individual that I might be coaching or giving feedback to, and the many hundreds, the organization, what happens when we are collective. And so it's, and it's not easy. There are no rules. It's a constant challenge of understanding that spectrum, I think. I've worked in big consultants. I've worked for, I think, some of the same organizations that you work for. I've worked for small organizations, and I've seen the good and the bad of both ends of the spectrum and probably everything in between. But I'm very lucky as somebody who can relate to the experience of being a consultant who now finds himself in, quite frankly, the luckiest position in the world, which is, running the best technology consultancy in the world, to kind of see the interplay between those two things. And even preparing for this podcast, I was kind of put in a bit of a spin of retrospection, because I had the joy this week of introducing our latest cohort of grads, people who have no concept necessarily of consultancy beyond what they've experienced through the process of coming here. So nothing to judge against or pros or cons, just like, this is what I'm being told the experience of consultancy is. This is what I'm being told how Scott Logic will look after me from a number of dimensions, and how it balances both the commitments that we make to our clients. Why we're in business is to help those people do the very difficult things that they need to do with their business. What we need to do to look after Scott Logic, this collective that comes together that allows us to do this thing. And then what we have to do in terms of the impact we want to have beyond our own walls, climate, society, the communities that we are a part of that sustain us, as well as what we want to do for the individuals. And so, my journey to Scott Logic, I was very happily employed elsewhere when someone called me and said, would you be interested about this other thing? And I think the interesting part of that process was, for me, 25 years into this career, I had the question, why would I want to do that? What is special or unique about this thing? And, I know we talked a little bit about it, Oliver, that, I find it, the more I've done, the more I've been fortunate enough to experience, the more I want to understand the why behind an organization, as much as the what, because I think the why has become increasingly important to me, and the successful businesses that I look to, that I respect, that I admire, have why front and center as the anchor for the what they actually do.
But we should point out, you are Oliver's boss, so he's only going to say very nice things about Scott Logic.
He is.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
That's not the Oliver I know. He tells me what I'm doing. Actually, that's a really good point. Actually, so one of the things, and I went into a loop of retrospection about, what's important to me, some of the questions we talked about. One of the ones that kind of came up was, this concept of feedback that I fundamentally believe in a whole bunch of stuff around transparency, about creating context for people to make good choices, about their contribution, how they best and maximize the potential they have. And one of the new grads said to me, "What's the most important thing you want me to know about Scott Logic?" And your brain goes into spinning Rolodex mode, like, oh, there's 110 things you need to know. And I came back to the one thing which I definitely know I talked to Oliver about this when he was considering whether or not he should or shouldn't join us, was that I fundamentally want an organization where everybody feels that they have the right to a voice. That if they believe they see something that could be better, if they see something that was good and they would like to see more of it or to see that thing happen again, they have the absolute right in the business to go, hey, can I tell you this thing? And that's not true for a lot of, I certainly didn't feel that. I was encouraged to use the critical thinking that I was required to use on my clients. I did not feel that I was always encouraged to use that same critical thinking for the improvement of my own organization. And even if I did, was it safe for me to speak up? So we often talk at Scott Logic that every employee has the right to share their opinion. And there's this other part of it, though, that I think is equally important, which is not only do they have the right, because they're a part of us, and because my hope is that they are genuinely committed to us, that right to a voice comes with a responsibility to use it. If you see a thing that could be better, if you see somebody do something profoundly impressive and you want to say, you have the right to say something and you have the responsibility to do so, without judgment and without fear.
And Steve, I think that's crucial to kind of like the inclusivity thing, which I have to say, out of all the places I've worked, and I've worked quite a few in my 20-ish sort of, I've done quite a few stints at different places. It's the most inclusive environment I've ever worked in, which was surprising because consultancy you expect to be quite cutthroat, very commercially focused, and the way that the kind of reality of the inclusivity in terms of giving people a voice is really interesting to see. So I see people who in other organizations would perhaps be very quiet, trying not to be noticed. Actually, they're very vocal and they are able to be themselves. They're able to bring their whole self to work, which is amazing. And I think it requires perhaps a bit of a corporate adjustment, because perhaps some people are used to certain ways of behaving in a corporate environment, but actually when you kind of see that people are more happy when they bring themselves to work and they're more productive, and there's a whole load of other benefits that kind of come off the back of it. But I have to say it's a credit to kind of to you and the wider sort of Scott Logic business that has that sort of inclusivity thing, because I think that's the key for me, that when you talk about voices being heard, it's ensuring the ones that perhaps would be quiet in a professional environment because they're afraid of what people might think of what they're going to say.
Well, let's talk about that, right? Because Wendy, we haven't heard from you yet, and I think this is the longest we've gone without speaking to you.
This is good.
Yeah, but is there a balance though, right? Because it's a company, it's not a summer camp, right? It's not, we all talk about there are no hierarchies. There's a hierarchy at a certain point, right? Someone has to set direction. It's not, it's not a commune, right, or something, right, where everything is up for. Where's the right balance? And Wendy, maybe this is something, because I know you're your own CEO, right? You have been a consultant. You run a company. You have people working for you. What's the right balance there between, the structure and the, everyone has an equal voice and all of that bit, right?
Yeah. Well, from my perspective, I sort of feel like there's this new covenant, right? This, what I'll say as the covenant of respect and value exchange. So sort of the way I run my business is very much in an ecosystem. So trying to put people together, fully leveraging, the flexibilities they want, the skills they want, the purpose they want to be part of, and just sort of honoring that sort of coming and going of what's best for people in their professional lives, while still everybody respecting the mission that we're trying to achieve. And that goes both sides. That goes both on the people that work for me and, and them, making sure that they continue to deliver on what we need in the continuity. So it's really, to me, about the covenant of like I said, respect and mutual value delivery. And I also love, as I'm hearing Steve and Oliver talk here, I really feel like I'm listening to strong modern leadership where you have this culture and values coming from the top, clearly rippling all the way down into reality. And you're balancing these, the three things I'm going to say you said, Steve, of how do we deliver to the client? How do we take care of people down to those individuals and the families behind it? And then also, how do we show up in our broader community? So, Chris, indeed, there's certainly a balance for that. But I think if we all just honor the mission and honor each other, and really think about the human behind it. I think
I love that, like this idea of a new covenant. And Steve, I wonder if you could for a second, you've got something like this, right? Can you tell us a little bit about the people promise and how that influences how people bring themselves to Scott Logic and how they show up and how they come to play and to work?
Sure. So we call it the People Promise. I can take no credit for it. It pre-existed before I arrived at the company. I mean, it was the total endorsement of, I don't think, it came up in the first couple of conversations I had before I joined Scott Logic. But then when somebody revealed it and said, and we have this thing, we call it the People Promises, here it is. It suddenly made every conversation line up behind that and said, and you really do this? Yeah. And we check with our people. We ask them, are we maintaining, our kind of part of the bargain? And so what the intention behind the People Promise was to say that consultancy is hard. It is difficult. You are going into other people's environments. You are potentially bringing new perspectives that challenge orthodoxy, and you're required to not just be technically competent at the role that you have, as in, to be an engineer or a project manager or a designer, but you also have to come with this other set of skills that allow you to influence and to give feedback that is intended to be helpful, but sometimes not is always well. It can be a difficult job to do. And so one of the things we set out to do, and I'm using the bigger we because I wasn't a part of constructing it, but I'm certainly part of living it, is create an agreement between the organization, a consultancy, and a bridge to the consultant to have a mutual agreement about what it is okay to expect from one another. And so the sorts of things that are kind of called out in the People Promise, and they are things I've experienced at other organizations in team level, but nothing that's been elevated to, we're going to make this, this is organizational, this is measurable. Actually, we're going to hold our leaders to account to how well they do it in upholding this promise. It covers things like we're not going to prioritize our delivery to our clients over the well-being of our people. That those two things have to be priorities that are balanced and are managed in equilibrium. It is important to a company like ours where we want to attract, retain, and grow some of the most capable, talented, crazy at times, but also lovely technology consultants that are available to us in the markets we operate in. And it is important to them that they are able to explore technology in a way that best suits the needs of their clients. So whilst we will pursue commercial alliances with other technology providers or service providers, we will not allow that to influence or degrade our independence of bringing good quality solutions to our clients. The other one, that gets played back to me a lot, and I talk about a lot, which is around this concept of, well, we've all been there as consultants, the deadline's approaching. We've got to throw it all in, and overtime becomes just assumed, or in my case, I've definitely been involved in the Death March project, where the unrealistic deadline, the immovable scope, the
all-night work,
budget, off you go.
Yeah.
And so one of the things we put in is we will not expect our people to work overtime. Full stop. Now,
Wendy's reaction here is like mine was when I first heard it, right? And so then throughout the rest of my recruitment process, I was sort of, tell me a bit about how that really worked. Because, of course, lots of people like to say these things, right? And then the reality is then somewhat different. But I have to say, that it wasn't the only thing, but it was one of the big things that made me realize that Scott Logic was different. I mean, it's a smaller organization. We're about 470 people, which I think helps as well, because you're able to kind of maintain a culture easier in a smaller organization. But this thing about not expecting our people to work overtime, of course, I do work overtime, but I do it because I choose to do it. I don't do it because someone is saying, right, this thing that we promised a client needs to be done. It's just a completely different shift in mentality, that we want our people to work overtime because they're passionate about things. That's okay if they want to do that. We're not doing it because someone didn't plan effectively in the first place.
Right. And I think that's the important one. One, which I think it covers a failure symptom, right? That says somebody somewhere did not think about the effort that's required to realize the outcome that's under here. And by moving that to the individual, an expectation the individual will make up the difference through overtime, hides the problem that actually the organization needs to address, which is how did we arrive in the position that actually additional effort is required, and not just additional effort that impacts that person's life away from here. Because that's essentially the tacit deal. You are going to give something up of yourself for the benefit of the organization due to a lack of understanding of what truly was needed. And so, I think what this does is, that custom software solutions are creating something from nothing. There is risk involved. There will be uncertainty, ambiguity, and volatility that will affect that endeavor that you cannot plan for and anticipate for. What we've committed to do is, first of all, just be better at understanding that volatility and manage for it, plan for it, expect it, and make sure that the burden of when it occurs is not transferred to the individual and their home life. That's why it's there. And I think we do quite a good job of it. In fact, I think we do an excellent job at maintaining that. And our people tell us that as well.
So how, I mean, that's interesting, right? Because there is this thing about, yes, that's what we say, but by God, this thing has to go out, or now we've got a problem. So how does that, maybe it's a return to the balance question, right? What is the commercial drive? How does that get accommodated? Because we're in business to be in business, to make money, to whatever the driving principle of the business is, and not to be too blunt about it, but we're not here to make everyone feel good about themselves, right? Kind of thing.
But if you think about it, the commercial driver here, and I was thinking about this when I was sort of processing this one about how does this actually work. The commercial driver for me, and I need to be a little bit careful because, of course, we're not about just exploiting client budgets. But the point of this one for me, from a commercial perspective, is that if we're doing overtime, is that necessarily being reflected in the charges to the client? Right. Possibly not, right? And so actually, that to Steve's point, the burden is placed on the individual to make up that delta. But actually, it's not in the consultancy's interest to give up their people's time for free. Right. Now, of course, this gets a little bit nuanced and difficult because it depends who's managing the piece of work, the engagement. It could be the client sort of bad planning. It could be our delivery manager's bad planning that results in someone being sort of asked to do it overtime in a situation where we don't have this promise. But for me, of course, it depends if you're doing outcome-based delivery and charge models. And there's obviously the charge model sort of aspects of this as well. But for me, if you are kind of doing a standard time and materials type engagement, it does not make sense commercially to have people do work for free because it's not there's no commercial benefit from that.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference between putting an extra couple of hours in because you realize that there's a crunch moment coming up, and finding yourself in a team environment for which an extra couple of hours is every day for the next 3 months. Yeah. There's a fundamental difference there. And I captured in, it's not that we might not have surges that are needed, but those are signposted, those are managed, those are an expectation, but that the pace is sustainable. that there is a long-term debt being created, which is the transfer of that person's personal time to the organization. And I think to Oliver's point, we're pretty upfront about this people promise with our clients. And rather than being a barrier to working with us, that's great that you do that. And I'm pretty direct with some of the senior decision makers in our clients. I mean, increasingly in the public sector, they are looking for this sort of care of our people. But certainly with the more, shall we say, commercially driven private sector clients, I'm very clear up front about why I do this. And why I do this is fundamentally does have a commercial reason, which is I've got good people. I don't want to lose them. And you don't want me to lose them. Because if I lose them, you don't have access to them. And these are the people who are going to care for your business, help you meet the challenges you've set out for yourself, and bring a level of expertise that you need to actually be achieving your goals. Yeah. And this helps me make sure I can sign up to the commitments that Scott Logic will make to you as my customer, because you support our ability to manage our business in this way.
Yeah, and I think there's I think this gets into the retention piece, right? As we talked, but I think there's a number of studies that show, right, that in environments where people feel like they are respected in the way that you're describing, right, they're willing to do the things that in other companies they're being forced to do, right, kind of thing. Right now they're willing to I'm willing to work an extra 20 hours this week, because I believe in the company and I feel respected and I feel heard and all of that stuff. And so I think that is really important. So let's focus on that retention bit for a second. So the people promise, that makes sense. What are some other ways? And Wendy, maybe you have a thought here too. Like, what are some other ways to really focus on that retention, right? Because we all know it's more expensive to go out and find a new employee than it is to try to keep the employees you have, right? So how do we keep people from leaving?
Yeah, indeed. Maybe I'll share a few thoughts. One, I think, clearly we've learned from the pandemic is a flexibility and a working with people's life. But, I think I've come to the realization, there's obviously no one size fits all. So giving people the benefits and the flexibility that work with their life, yet, deliver and honor our commitments and our culture. I also think, a big part of it is purposeful work and interesting things that we like doing, right? That's a big part of what keeps people in a certain place, right? We're growing, we love it. And then I think there's just very much the human side that we always have to think about. So, building relationships with people on the team, feeling like you're part of it, feeling like you're connected to the bigger picture and really hooked in. I think that's another big one as well.
Is there a generational aspect to this? In other words, are there new expectations for things like the covenant or the people promise, those types of things? Are they coming out of college thinking that's the norm, right? And then they go to, I don't know, who should we pick on? Let's not pick on Deloitte today. Then they go to PwC, and that's not how it is, right? And now they're disillusioned and bitter or angry or whatever it might be. Is there a generational part of this that we need to begin to take into account?
I mean,
for
Steve,
anybody.
I'll kind of hand to you in a second, but I think particularly in technology, it's notwithstanding the current blip we're seeing in sort of the hiring cycle that's going on at the moment, it's very difficult to hire good technologists that are also kind of well-rounded consultants and good communicators and all that, or that tick more than just the sort of good technologist box. And so I think the kind of people that we're looking to attract are highly emotionally intelligent, and therefore they look for these sorts of things in an employer, I think. And it's no longer sort of good enough, I think, to have a prestigious brand. I think you mentioned some of those big four names just then. I think in the past, that would have been enough, right? That you would just go to one of those because that was a great place to start your career or spend your whole career after graduating. And I think now, I think people are becoming more demanding because they can be, because the tech industry has shown there are other ways of working. There are potential other kind of benefits in addition to pay. There are flexibilities about where you work, amount of holiday you can take, all these sort of things are now I guess, entering into the sort of employee expectation. I think for a tech consultancy, it's challenging because you're not just competing against other consultancies, you're competing against the sort of tech industry at large and other technology roles. So for me, I think people are getting savvier about what they can ask for. They're perhaps getting a bit more demanding, but then I think it's a quid pro quo, right? If you're asking for certain things, then you need to be kind of committing and delivering on the other side. But I personally think that's why this was changing, and I see it from some of my younger friends. I see them sort of expecting a different sort of contract, as it were, or commitment from their employer. But Steve, I don't know what your sort of perception is of this one.
Well, I don't think there's like a step change that happens with every culture, every generation. But I definitely feel like there's a wave. My first consulting gig was, there's your ticket, wave goodbye on a Monday morning. You'll be staying in a hotel in some godforsaken industrial park somewhere, and you'll be back late on a Friday night. And I never thought twice about it. I was working with a good brand. I was getting good development opportunities.
It was exciting, right?
It was exciting. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Standard class on a train in the United Kingdom. So exciting. And so
let's not get going about trains, Steve. That's a whole nother topic.
Sorry.
That's a topic that we've had to stop talking about.
So I never thought to question it. And also, the idea that the technology that I was using, I was just being glad to be given a laptop. Yeah. Possibly an Abacus when I started, but you know what I mean. And so I do think expectations have changed. I do think the more I guess the more experience I had, the more I wanted to move with these new expectations as well. At least I wanted to understand them. I mean, the nature of my job is I still travel around the UK, and I love it because it puts me in contact with our clients and our people, and I get a lot from that. I also understand I don't have kids at home. I don't have a dog. So the things that might otherwise be a priority for me, might otherwise be a priority for other people, are not necessarily a priority for me. But I also recognize, I've got a young nephew, and he is now working for one of the big four, which we've had words about. Bless him. But I remember, his expectations of coming out of university were exactly like you were talking, Chris. I'll work when I want, where I want. I'll get to pick which technologies.
There's a foosball table, right? There's
beanbags was his big
coffee.
thing. I can, kind of lean back and he's landed in one of the big four, and that is not the experience. And in fact, he's out in Australia, which is where I'm from. But there is a coming down the line. You are expected to be. You will be in the office 4 days a week. What's missing for him? I had the conversation about, if you came together as a team and came up with a proposition about how you did do the team working together, but also were able then to disperse on the more independent work. He said nobody wants to hear that. And so you're back to a voice, you're back to a responsibility to use it, you're back to a leadership that's willing and interested in hearing from the worker, the person doing the work, and rather than the manager or the director of the manager and kind of thing. So I do think there are changing expectations, and I think successful businesses are those that are kind of tapping in and saying, well, how do we align things? I know for some of the businesses I used to work in, it would not be acceptable to be fully remote 100% of the time and never visit a client. Personally, I would never want to work like that, but I do understand others might. But there would need to be a conversation about how do we actually do what we're here to do, and to the degree that we can accommodate individual and personal need, how do we bring those two things together? And I think if the organization is not set up to have a conversation of that, that is going to end up with pissed off people, high levels of attrition, I think long-term systemic damage to both brand and to business.
No, I think that's a really good point about angry, pissed off people. I think, we'll excuse the big four for a second, and let's talk about MBB for a second, right? And McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. And I think in those environments, right, the pressure is on, the expectations are extremely high, higher than I think you would say for big four consultancies. Mm-hmm. And there, I think, people, speaking on behalf of people I know that work in these companies, but I think the feeling is there's a prestige element to it as well, right? At some of these places where, yes, I don't have the covenant that we've discussed, but it's made up for by I can fly business class or whatever it might be, right? And those sorts of things, those prestige, those ego things that I feel better because of that.
But I think this potentially comes at a very high cost, and
It does. I think so.
Difficult thing.
Divorce rates, by the way, I think are very high, right?
Yep.
But let's get real for a moment. Like some people, it all gets too much for them in these high pressure environments, and it's not talked about very widely because it's a taboo thing to talk about. Suicide is a thing in these high pressure environments.
Yes,
of course, mental health is, but ultimately that can lead some individuals to taking their own life because the pressure is just so much. So this thing is, yes, there is the potential for glory and great success and money and all this sort of stuff, but it comes at a price potentially. And I have to say, this is why, going back to the beginning of when we started recording this one, that's why I came back into consulting with my eyes open, because I wasn't going to kill myself, but I was broken mentally. There was a couple of weeks of my life that were not great at all, and my wife had to have a serious conversation with me about my sort of career choices. And so this stuff, when it goes off the rails, it can really go off the rails for people. So I think it's the kind of psychological safety thing and the sort of transparency around. How are you doing? And that not to be in the very British polite way of saying how are you doing, but actually let's have a nice conversation about, is this working for you? Is this engagement too much? What support do you need? It's having that sort of level of culture for me that is super, super important, because otherwise if people just put a brave face on and just go, yeah, it's all good, and don't really say what's going on and don't have that psychological safety there, that's when I think things, that's when the darker side of that potentially very prestigious organization starts to rear its ugly head.
Right. Or they cover it up with, I'm really engaged with, the valuable work we're doing and this and that and the other. And look at this, I'm really passionate about this. And meanwhile, their life is falling apart. Right. And it's like, I think that borders on the mental health stuff. I know we've talked a lot about that, but there was a word that you used there, which I think, is on topic here, which is transparency, right? Which is how, where does that play in? Because does every business really want their employees to be 100% transparent about everything, right? About like at the town hall meeting, I think I told the story about a town hall meeting I was in a number of years ago, and they were like, ask any questions. And I'm like, and I was that guy asking that question that made everyone cringe. Like, oh my God, he's really asking that out loud. Right. So there's respectable transparency, right? And there's not. But even within the respectable transparency, I think there's a question of how much of that do you really want? Do you really need in order to maintain this covenant that we're talking about, to respect the individual voices of the firm? I don't know where that boundary is. Maybe it's different by company, by context. I don't know.
Well, I do remember, again, one of my first consulting employers used to have a monthly meeting where they went through all the numbers. And I remember sitting there, and it was, I think, month one, I've just joined, so excited. The numbers were dreadful. And I was kind of sitting there going, do I have a job on Monday? Like, why are you telling me this? What can I do? So I do think there is something to be considered, the difference between data and information and context. I want to be very clear with my organization, the context in which decisions are being made, or things that are coming down the line, how they might impact. I think it's very important that context is set. That's rooted in mission and purpose for me. But there's a certain amount of information that I want to be able to share with people where I believe if they understand the context, it gives them the ability to make good decisions. They understand how they can contribute. I think there's sometimes a desire, and I've seen this in some organizations, to show me everything. Because I'm interested, and there's a degree to what is that useful. Right? At the context level, I can say, well, this is the framework about how decisions will be made. The new minutiae of detail that can only be something you have to spend time consuming. So I think there is also that particular risk where you kind of go, well, share everything, and then people go, oh, I'm going to spend a day tomorrow just reading everything that Stephen sent out. And so I think there's that as well. So I do think about use. like, to what purpose will this information be useful to the person I'm sharing it with? To what, to what end will this help them make better decisions in their day-to-day work? And how does it better inform their understanding of the work that they do and its connection to why the business exists and what we're setting out to do? But I do think it's different in every business. And I've been in that spot where you kind of go, hey, I've got a question. And everyone else is like, dude, shut up.
Yeah. Well, it led to, basically people not trusting me, my peers, not the executives, the peers. Don't tell Lockhart that. He's going to go out there and ask
actually asked that question.
Right.
I think
I want to touch on this because you said, the context matters, right? Does the culture or the country matter? Wendy, you're in Norway. Is it different there? How does transparency? Like, there are some cultures it's very conservative, or that's not the right word. Very traditional, and the boss knows the info and the employees do the thing, right? Is it cultural? Is it different? Like, I imagine it's different in Europe than it is in the U.S. when it comes to this sort of thing.
Yeah. I'm having grown up in the U.S. and now living in Norway, I'm utterly fascinated all the time about all these things. Transparency. I love that you asked about that one specifically, because there's so much transparency here. It's expected. It's cultural. It's like, that's who we are. For example, we can go see everybody's salary and have the transparency of knowing who's looking at it, right? So it's very transparent. Even just how we do financial transactions and things like that, it's actually very slick and impressive and transparent at all levels. But I also think about things like the respect and employee expectations too. There are in contracts in Norway, like you have a 3-month period of, giving notice or, before you're actually moving out of a job. So I also feel like it's culture and it's law that honestly, I can't even picture some of the things that have happened in the tech companies happening in Norway. I cannot even picture it. Just the people wouldn't do it and the people wouldn't take it because they're also very empowered here.
I won't mention where, but I've been at places where the way people found out that they were let go is their cell phone stopped working, or they come back to their desk after lunch and their laptop's been collected by the security or the equipment people. Right? It's like,
it's a bit like dumping someone by text or ending a relationship. But no one would ever find that acceptable. Maybe some people do it, but it's certainly not a nice way to sort of tell someone a relationship's ending. The work relationship is, again, it's not a personal relationship; it's a business relationship.
Sure.
But all the same, people deserve a common courtesy of having a conversation. I think everyone reasonable people understand that businesses go through difficult times or they have to make difficult decisions. And again, back to Steve's point about context. Having that sort of context, and because again, I know we're still isn't about mental health, but it kind of has an impact on people's kind of perception of themselves, their own self-worth. If they don't have any kind of rationale for, well, why have I been let go? And was I really so bad that they removed my laptop? Did I do something really, really wrong? Did I do gross misconduct? What happened there? So the story, and I'm sure the media is exaggerating to a degree some of what's going on, but unfortunately, that cultural difference for me is I was working for a US company before Scott Logic, and unfortunately they're laying people off, and some of the stories aren't great, because in the US it seems you can just sort of hire and fire, and that is probably the biggest difference between the European and American culture.
It definitely is a more pro business owner environment, right? Culturally, I think the other thing, it's like, what does it say to the people who are remaining? What does it say about how much the company respects them when they escort people out with security and, cold in their little boxes, right? Remember the Lehman Brothers collapse and the stream of people coming out of the building with their little boxes with their stuff in it, right? Escorted out of a building by security. I'm a threat. You need to escort me out. Security has to lead me out of the building. It's crazy, right? But it's routine here. And it's also routine to do it, on a certain day of the week, right? Depending on what your philosophy is, right? You do it on a Monday so that people don't have all weekend. If they get fired on a Friday, they don't have all weekend to stew about it and then show up and, cause some violent action or something like that, right? So there's all of this interesting thing, but like, what does it say about what the company thinks about you when all of this goes into play? I just think it's kind of fascinating, and I do think it is cultural, right? I think there is a difference.
Definitely. I mean, I consulted to a US organization who very proudly showed me that they had a room set up for this, that people came in one door,
and out the
whilst
other.
they were in the room, somebody was cleaning the desk out, and it's like the lack of humanity that just went into the fact you designed a special room with this specifically in mind. And I worry about, obviously there's the impact on the individual who's just lost their job, but what that's, to your point, Chris, what that is going to say to the people who are sitting left in that business, that if this, I think how you treat people who leave your organization, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, says a lot about the level of care you provide to the people who are within your organization.
Right.
And I think it behoves leaders to think very carefully about not just how to handle that process, but to be very introspective about how they got in that position in the first place. And again, to ensuring that everyone understands what's being done to avoid it. Nobody goes into business to fire people. Sometimes economic conditions, unanticipated outcomes require a business to reshape itself to remain competitive. But I have certainly been through processes where I have seen good colleagues exited. I've understood the context as to what happened, as to why that was necessary. I've actually been through processes where I think actually that was done with dignity and care. I have also been through, even in those circumstances, where I've sat there and said, but what is somebody doing to think about how we never have to do this again?
Right. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, right? You call the covenant the people promise. I wrote a book called The People Problem because to me it's at the core, right? It goes to the planning that we talked about, right? It's bad planning. Why were we here in the first place? Why did we have to work overtime? We didn't scope this thing right. In a broader business sense, we didn't really structure the organization right to meet the demand in the market and all of those things. We didn't build enough flexibility into our ability to adapt to changing market conditions. It's bad planning, right? Mm-hmm. All around, if you think about it, bad management and bad planning.
Well, honestly, I just applaud and appreciate what you all are doing. I feel like this is a conversation that needs to be had. This is the example that needs to be out there. This is the future of consulting. And it's, as you were saying, and Chris, you were even alluding to it right now with the people problem and the lack of planning and things. If you look at this and said, as your words, sustainable, right? How do we have a sustainable way for people to work, which leads to retention and which leads to, everybody having the life they want and doing the appropriate planning? Like, that's the way to go. That's how we need to be. And I actually feel like this is so significant that, and we've done it on the show, right? We've put up the memes, we've laughed about the industrial parks and all these hours, but that's not right. And we're glorifying it and we're passing it down to the people because it happened to us. So it's a new day, new leadership, new way of consulting. So just hats off to leading that way.
I wanted to jump on something you said, Chris, about business owners, right? So I think you said, in the US, it favors business owners. I think we need to rethink what business ownership means and shared ownership for me, not in a communist sort of sense, right? Don't get me wrong. Don't call me a massive lefty here, Chris. But getting people to buy in and get a sense of ownership requires, the psychological safety I was talking about earlier. It requires trust. It requires people to build relationships that aren't then just all of a sudden disconnected when someone is escorted out of the building. So for me, it's this sort of, if you want people to really care about the commitments they're making to clients and to each other, you need to build that kind of trust and respect, and people need to have that shared sense of shared ownership. So I think that for me is a culture that needs to be rethought, and that's what people are looking for. I think people are looking for that kind of voice, as Steve was mentioning earlier, and that kind of involvement and being listened to. But I mean, look, as Steve said, we're not perfect, but it's been really interesting for me the last 4 or 5 months that Scholar just kind of look at how consulting can be different. It doesn't have to be as cutthroat. It doesn't have to be as sharky or as political. we can actually find ways of balancing people, community, and profit and kind of commercial interests. So no, I appreciate you, Chris, kind of making the space for us to have this conversation.
Yeah, and before we give Steve the final comment here, just a quick thought for me. You guys might know, Steve might not know, I'm a history major, right? That's the only degree I have. And I'm currently, last year I spent most of the year reading Churchill, right? This year I'm spending a lot of time on Teddy Roosevelt. And Roosevelt broke up the trusts, the monopolies, right? And so in reading through that, right, there's this whole theme of labor versus capital, right? Of the worker versus the boss, right? All of this stuff. And I think it's a similar theme, but I think we're looking at it now in these times differently, which is the folks that are working for the company are not really working for the company, right? They are working for themselves in advancing the company and having all of those ideals come together in a covenant. I really like that word as part of this, right? I think that makes sense because you, as a business owner, you don't want people working for you that don't want to be there. And as a worker, you don't want to work for a company that doesn't value you, right? And so it seems like there would be a natural alignment of labor and capital, right, to come up with an agreement of what are the expectations of the business and from the workers and of the workers from the business. I think it's fantastic. So, Steve, thank you for joining us. I'll give you the last word here.
Sure. Look, I'll keep it short. The big thing for me, and I heard it, I think, in some of the things you were talking about, Wendy, is why are things the way they are? Why do we see businesses behave the way they behave? And there's a growing desire to see businesses mature and grow and learn and be more concerned with the humans that inhabit them. That it is less the organization, but the combination of individuals that create them. And so one of the things, and again, I've talked earlier about this, is one of the things I spend a lot of my time thinking about is releasing the leadership potential of the generation that's coming behind me. I will not be doing this job forever. At some point, somebody else will be the CEO of Scott Logic. And at some point, there'll be a whole bunch of new people. And what I want to encourage is them to explore new models of leadership, not to look at the patterns that they have experienced in the past and assume that is how they must be to be successful. I think that is the biggest lesson, which is to take, and we're consultants, right? We apply critical thinking, we solve problems. Let's bring that to how we want our businesses to be, as much as how much we can contribute to the businesses that we consult to.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Steve, thanks for joining. Don't be too hard on Oliver in his performance review. We we like him. You should retain him.
I like him too. It's all right. He's good.
We'll make sure you've written a number of articles on the Scott Logic blog. There's one I think is really good, the New Normal for Leadership. We'll put the links up on that because I think that really captures a lot of this stuff. So Oliver, thank you. Wendy, thank you. Steve, thank you. I'm Chris Lockhart, everybody. Thank you very much, and see everyone next time. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Consultants Saying Things. I'm Chris Lockhart, joined today by Oliver Cronk, Wendy Keene, and special guest, Steve Forshaw. Oh, shit, I fucked that up. Forshaw. My mistake.
I mean, I literally answer anything. The names I get called.
Yeah.
Forshaw is not
okay. All right, here we go.
Yeah, well, I have to say, credit.
Don't try to be too nice to your boss on this one.
Well, I was also going to have a little dig at you for. I'm going to nominate your smoothest plug of your book there. When we have our awards at the end of the year, because we typically have awards for the cast. And that's definitely going to be a candidate for the smoothest plug of your book on the podcast. So well done for that. But going back to a more serious note,